In the winter of 1970, actor Dustin Hoffman was experiencing a tremendous rise in popularity. In December 1967, his breakout role in the movie The Graduate became an instant classic because of Hoffman's portrayal of the disaffected American youth in the 1960s. 2 years later, Hoffman followed this performance with yet another acclaimed role as a disabled sex worker and drug dealer in Manhattan. By 1970, it became clear that Dustin Hoffman was a rising star in Hollywood. Hoffman's star was shining brightly in a very intense decade in American history. The morning of March 6, 1970, Dustin Hoffman left his West Village apartment in New York City to order coffee and to attend a screening role. Upon his return, he saw flashing lights and sirens surrounding his dwelling. As he walked closer, it appeared that his dwelling had all but collapsed. Firefighters who responded to the distress call from Dustin Hoffman's home first thought that this was an explosion from a gas leak inside the building. But police officials began to suspect something larger when many of the survivors had suddenly disappeared. Later on that evening, investigating officials found several bombs in the basement of Dustin Hoffman's apartment building that was occupied by different tenants. These tenants were associated with the radical activist group known as the Weather Underground. The bombs were intended for specific targets. 2 bombs were intended for a non-commissioner's dance party in Fort Dix, New Jersey. 2 other bombs were intended for an administrative building on the Columbia University campus. Hoffman's rising star in Hollywood was one of many gleaming moments of intensity, more than any other decade except perhaps the 1850s and perhaps our own decade in which we live. American society had become extremely polarized and radicalized through political activism. Society was fractured along political lines, and it seemed as though there was no reconciling those polar opposites. It seemed as though political discourse had devolved into violence. The 1960s were an incredibly intense moment in American history that set the stage for the rest of the century. In this lecture, we'll be talking about the continuing civil rights movement, the administrations of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson, and how they progressed civil rights through their administrations. Then we'll talk about the transformation of the civil rights movement towards Black Power, and then finally the galvanization of the new left movements through their involvement with anti-war campaigns and activism associated with the war in Vietnam. As we left off from last lecture, we realized that there was another side to Eisenhower America. While the standard of living increased for many white Americans living in the suburbs, poverty was just another facet of life for Black Americans living in the country and in cities at this time. Poverty in rural landscapes was quite common, when farmers earned half the national average income. Non-white unemployment levels across America during this time were at 40%. And in addition to poverty, many blacks still face segregation and discrimination, not only in the hands of paramilitary groups like a Ku Klux Klan, but even by the hands of police. Although the progressive movements of previous eras attempted to enhance black civil rights, many blacks considered these only minor victories that failed to address the larger structural issues in American society. Integration in Eisenhower America, for example, did not occur on large scale, and not all at once. It was a slow and gradual process. By 1965, less than 2% of all Southern schools were actually integrated by that time. Increased incidences of anti-black violence continued to galvanize the civil rights movement. In 1955, the death of Emmett Till and the publicization of the images of his mutilated body stoked the antagonism and the activism of civil rights protests. And so the early years of the 1960s, we can see the organization of black protest movements into specific units. For example, as early as 1960 itself, the lunch counter boycott protests spread across the South. 2 civil rights organizations in particular formed in 1960 and became vanguards of black civil rights going forward. In April 1960, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee formed out of the splintered remains of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference at the leadership of Ella Baker. And immediately, SNCC, as they became known, took a more militant stance than the Southern Christian Leadership Conference by actively engaging by moving away from the peaceful, nonviolent protests that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had been known for. Secondly, in December 1960, the Congress for Racial Equality was formed under the leadership of James Farmer, who organized what were known as Freedom Rides, which were essentially forced integration of Southern bus lines and stations. The Freedom Ride movement spread across the South as buses left Washington, D.C. and headed southward to Alabama and Mississippi, to the most segregated areas. Trouble was, of course, angry white mobs attacked the buses, setting them on fire and severely beating several of the Freedom Riders. Ultimately, Attorney General Robert Kennedy deputized many local officials to escort these Freedom Ride buses. By 1963, Alabama itself had become the center of the civil rights movement. Leading a march on Birmingham, Alabama, Martin Luther King was finally arrested by local officials, writing his famous Letter from Birmingham Jail, in which he debates the efficacy and value of peaceful, nonviolent protest as opposed to more aggressive military tactics that he saw with SNCC. Media images here again are extremely important for galvanizing protest. Television crews captured the brutality of southern towns, which horrified many Americans, but also caused many Birmingham blacks to reject the nonviolent protest tactics of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Finally, by the summer of 1963, after Martin Luther King was released from jail, he led the famous March on Washington, in which he delivers the famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which again captured by news media and galvanized support around the civil rights movement. So through the first half of the 1960s, we can see an escalation of civil rights protest and a turn away from nonviolence as a form of protest. And the Kennedy administration played no small role in this development. Unlike the Eisenhower administration, Kennedy was more active in supporting the civil rights movement. The Kennedy administration appointed more than 40 black officials to prominent positions in the federal government. NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall, who cut his teeth on the Brown versus Board of Ed case, was himself appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals, later serving as the first black official on the Supreme Court. Despite his heroic leadership with respect to civil rights legislation, however, Kennedy by 1963 was losing credibility and losing popularity in the polls with respect to his stance on Soviet Russia. When elected in 1960, Kennedy packed his cabinet with a host of successful businessmen and intellectuals, particularly those from Harvard. Robert McNamara, for example, who previously served as president of the Henry Ford Motor Company, served as a quite adept Secretary of Defense during Kennedy's administration, and continued on during the Lyndon Baines Johnson administration as Secretary of Defense. Overall, Kennedy's programs were moderate and followed the New Deal tradition, as did Eisenhower's administration before him. Unlike the Eisenhower administration, however, Cold War tensions came to a boil under Kennedy. And we can see this most clearly in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. In 1959, communist revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro overthrew the democratically backed government in Cuba, dramatically reshaping the balance of power in the Cold War paradigm. For the first time, Soviet Union had intervened directly in America's sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. Aided by Soviet Russia, both financially and militarily, Fidel Castro and the revolutionaries in Cuba began installing nuclear installations, with which it would attempt to transform diplomatic negotiations with the United States. Upon learning of these nuclear installations, the Kennedy administration immediately placed an embargo on Cuba, severing the strong trade ties that had developed in the first half of the 20th century. U.S. warships surrendered the island with the ultimatum of de-escalating this development of nuclear technology, or else the warships would fire on the island. For a tense 2 weeks in October 1962, it seemed as though nuclear holocaust was at the doorstep of an American republic. From its location on the island of Cuba, communists had the potential to launch nuclear missiles at all major metropolitan areas throughout the country. In the end, the communists ultimately backed down, agreeing to disarm its military installations in Havana, agreeing to disarm its military installations in the countryside in Cuba, and capitulate to the Kennedys' demands. Nonetheless, the embargo that Kennedy imposed on Cuba remained intact throughout the rest of the 20th century and continues today. In November 1960, not more than a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Lyndon Baines Johnson, Kennedy's vice president, was immediately sworn in as president on board the plane that was carrying the president's body back to Washington. The assassination of the president shocked the country, but from that moment, Johnson vowed to continue Kennedy's legacy with the initiative of civil rights. It's under Johnson that Thurgood Marshall is ultimately appointed as Supreme Court Justice. And there's 3 pieces of legislation under the Johnson administration that particularly addresses civil rights in the South. Number 1, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which established a Commission of Civil Rights, which was to oversee and protect black civil rights in the South. Number 2, the 24th Amendment, which, again, of course, banned poll taxes, which was one of the major limitations for black voting rights in the South. And finally, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which again outlawed Southern literacy tests and authorized federal supervision of Southern elections so as to mitigate voter suppression in the South. The election of 1964 was a consequential election not because it was a landslide for Johnson, but because it established a foothold for the new American conservative movement. And this is something we're going to cover in next lecture. But it's Barry Goldwater's first entrance in American national politics. From his constituency running as a senator in Arizona, Barry Goldwater formed a movement that later overtook American politics by the end of the 1970s. This conservative movement that galvanized through the This conservative movement that culminated into the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 starts with Barry Goldwater. And he makes his first entrance as a presidential candidate in 1964. But Johnson's administration was far from the epitome of the conservative movement. Johnson wanted to build a better society where, quote, progress is the servant of the neediest. Johnson recognized the political opening from the Kennedy assassination that immediately committed himself to Kennedy's agenda, and by January 1964 he expanded upon it with an unconditional war on poverty. Johnson was a passionate New Dealer. What becomes known as the Great Society is a package of legislation that Johnson pushes through Congress in order to transform American society and attend to many of the inequities left over from the New Deal. Between 1964 and 1968, more than 60 Great Society programs were put in place in the United States. Most sought to provide better economic and social opportunities by removing many of the barriers thrown up by healthcare, education, religion, and race. Johnson's Great Society program was the most consequential body of legislation since the New Deal. And we've never seen something like this since. Many of the public institutions that we know today were started by Lyndon Baines Johnson. PBS and NPR, for example, both started through Great Society programs. Medicaid, Medicare, also Great Society programs. The Peace Corps, Great Society program. Head Start, and even the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, both part of the Great Society. We can spend an entire lecture, in fact, an entire semester going through all of the different facets of the Great Society programs. But what it amounts to is a reallocation of federal money towards social welfare benefits. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 is probably the most important of these pieces of legislation in the context of our discussions this semester. So what this piece of legislation did was abolish the national origins formula established from the Johnson Quota Act of 1924, which essentially placed restrictions on non-white immigrants. So after the passage of 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, you see those new waves of immigrants that changes the composition of the American people. In particular, you see a massive surge of immigrants from the Caribbean and Southeast Asia. Midway through the Johnson administration, the black civil rights movement began to change based on the conditions that we saw in the Kennedy administration. Most particularly by the summer of 1964, white-on-black violence continued to grow in the American South. You talk about fear, one activist said from Alabama, "It's like the heat down here. It's continually oppressive. You think they're national, but you suddenly realize they want to kill you." From June to August 1964, Mississippi oversaw at least 35 different shooting incidences and buildings bombed, many of them churches. Hundreds of people during that summer were beaten and arrested. It's really stoked the embers of activism. New leaders like Fannie Lou Hamer and Stokely Carmichael, later known as Kwame Ture, led the black movement in a different direction. In 1966, the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Stokely Carmichael, unified black activism by emphasizing power through solidarity with all the disparate organizations of the civil rights movement. "I'm not going to beg the white man for anything I deserve," Carmichael said. "I'm going to take it." And this represented a juncture away from the nonviolent tactics of Martin Luther King. This new cohort of black activists began espousing what was known as black power. This new black power tradition rejected the nonviolence and coalition-building traditions of the civil rights groups in previous eras. By 1967, Martin Luther King himself had shifted the tone in his rhetoric by focusing on the legal rights and economic rights of black people, becoming the hero of not only the black underclass, but working people generally. In 1966, a new black organization calling themselves the Black Panthers emerged in Oakland, California. The Black Panthers were just one of the black organizations that arose during the end of the 1960s to address the limited delivery of many of the Great Society programs. They espoused welfare rights, housing issues, fair unemployment. They advocated for welfare rights, housing issues, fair employment, and anti-poverty programs. By all intents and purposes, the black civil rights movement had transformed to encompass a broader agenda and to attack many of the structural issues that limited social mobility in America. By 1968, many leaders of this new movement came under fire. It seemed as though the civil rights movement was becoming too radical to appeal to middle of the road, to appeal to moderate voters and constituencies. In April 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated by a white racist in Tennessee, only stoking the embers of this growing movement. From 1964 to 1967, riots and uprising engulfed American cities, stemming from the exodus of middle class homeowners to the suburbs and stemming from the exodus of middle-class homeowners and corporations to the suburbs. Cities by the end of the 1960s were in ruins. Schools were overwhelmingly overcrowded. Unemployment skyrocketed. And cities that relied on the middle-class tax base to supply public programs and maintain vital services began to decline. By the middle of the 1960s, it seemed as though cities were in a crisis. And to some extent they were. And this crisis was articulated through many of the uprisings that we see during this time. In August 1965, for example, in Watts, a suburb of LA, a drunk driving arrest erupted into a riot in which stores were looted and burned to the ground, cars were overturned and set ablaze, and firefighters were even attacked. More than 900 people were injured in the Watts protests, and more than $45 million in property was destroyed. And we see this also in the Newark Uprising 1967, in which another incident of police brutality stoked a devastating riot in the city. Many of these riots were associated with many of the structural issues that the Black Power leaders are fighting for, namely unemployment, inequality, police brutality, and many of the structural and economic issues that were underpinning black poverty in cities in the 1960s. And so the urban crisis, as it comes to be known, is really a humanitarian crisis in which black people and non-white people generally are left behind in cities that are declining. The Kerner Report, published in 1968, was a presidential commission under the Johnson administration which organized representatives from various American cities to discuss and explore the issues surrounding many of these uprisings. The findings of the Kerner Report reflected this stark divide in American cities. Our nation is moving towards two societies, the Kerner Report remarked. One black, one white, separate and unequal. Overall, the report was a strong indictment against white America. What white Americans have never fully understood, the report reflected, but what the Negro can never forget, is that the white society is deeply implicated in the formation of the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. The Kerner Report furthermore reflects the urban crisis as a humanitarian crisis and a failure of civil rights that produced a generation of non-white poverty in America, only further intensifying social stratification and the polarization of the American political landscape. Within civil rights protests, young college-age adults were among the loudest and most militant of those activists calling for change. This was the boomer generation who reconceptualized the college campus as a haven for free thought and social change. The New Left movement was a disparate collection of various activist groups like Students for Democratic Society and the anti-war movement that coalesced on college campuses. Among all the New Left organizations, the Students for Democratic Society were among the most militant agitators. They organized protest marches, reflecting many of the civil rights marches before them. They organized teach-ins, which were known as consciousness-raising educational sessions, as well as draft card burnings, symbolically opposing the domination of the state. Similarly, the anti-war movement grew out of the New Left. And the anti-war movement construed opposition to the Vietnam War as a civil rights issue. Fundamental to this anti-war movement was, of course, the draft. Agitators realized that white middle-class students could really defer from the draft lottery by attending colleges, whereas lower-class non-whites were more vulnerable to the draft. Not only that, but blacks accounted for at least 12% of American population, whereas blacks made up nearly 50% of the frontline forces in Vietnam, and accounted for more than 25% of the casualties. Between SDS and the anti-war movement, these two organizations provided a platform for further radical organizations like the Weather Underground to emerge in American politics. Behind this dissent was this increasing inequality in America that was demonstrated upon two fronts. That was demonstrated upon two faults: gender and race. In 1963, the Kennedy administration established the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. Like the Kerner Commission of the Johnson administration, this Presidential Commission identified many of the structural issues that plagued many women in America. The Commission confirmed that women constituted an underclass in American society. It confirmed that women rarely reached the top positions in their industry, and that women worked for less pay than men. The findings of this Presidential Commission led to the formation of various organizations. By 1966, the National Organization for Women, otherwise known as NOW, formed as a vanguard for women's rights in the growing feminist movement in the 1960s. This was just one organization of many that fought for equal protection and against discrimination against women. The ultimate goal of NOW and the feminist movement was, of course, the Equal Rights Constitutional Amendment, which would ensure gender equality, easier access to birth control devices, and the right to have an abortion. Keep in mind, this is the very same issues that people like Margaret Sanger were fighting for at the turn of the century. The Equal Rights Amendment was put to a vote many times, first in 1972 and later in the 1980s. Ultimately, it failed and never passed. And so many of the same causes and issues that women in the 1960s, as well as those in the turn of the century, were fighting for, continue to structure our society. Closely associated with the women's rights movement, gay liberation was also a huge force in the 1960s. For most of the 20th century up to this point, homosexuality was regarded as a perversion that damaged the social fabric of America. The Eisenhower administration saw an increasingly open gay subculture subverting conservative values in American society. And Eisenhower administration explicitly barred homosexuals from most government jobs and created vice squads that would crack down on gay social organizations, such as gay bars. The Stonewall riot in 1969 in New York City represented the emergence of the gay liberation movement led by activists like Martha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who also advocated for gender justice. We can think about Latino activism and indigenous activism as also part of this new left movement. Labor leaders like Cesar Chavez organized many Latino immigrants, many of them who came over through the Bracero program in the 1940s and now were fighting for their own rights. Similarly, indigenous activists fought for land that had been confiscated from them throughout American history, all part of this groundswell of activism that we know of as the 60s. The 1960s was a maelstrom of activism that culminated in the Democratic National Convention in 1968, in which various representatives from the New Left movement organized and surrounded the Democratic National Convention to make their demands known to a broad public audience. The Democratic National Convention ultimately ended in bloodshed as police brutality attempted to remove many of these protesters from the national spotlight. Still, again, television is so important for the story. News crews captured the image of violence and police brutality that circulated throughout the country, and further disaffected many middle-of-the-road American voters that saw these images and the violence on their television screens. The 1960s ended with the rise of the right. Under extreme stress, Johnson refused to run for a second term, leaving the Democratic Party fractured by radicalism. Recognizing a political opening, Richard Nixon seized on this political vacuum in attempting to appeal to middle-class voters across the country. The presidential election in 1968 wasn't even close. Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic candidate who ran against Kennedy in the primary in 1960, lacked the charisma that Kennedy and even Johnson had. To many Americans, Richard Nixon represented a candidate who can restore law and order, so to speak, and some sense of solidarity in American politics. Ultimately, many American voters were looking for stability in American politics. And this is something that Nixon thought that he could deliver. Overall, the presidential election in 1968 transformed the American political landscape. And this is something that we're going to talk about in the next lecture with the rise of the right. So some key terms in this lecture that you need to keep in mind for the final exam are SNCC, of course, the March on Washington, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Immigration and Nationality Act in 1965, the Great Society, who was Marsha P. Johnson, who is Fannie Lou Hamer, Stokely Carmichael, the Kerner Report, and the Feminine Mystique.